Okay, this is the third video on Mother Teresa for RT 303, Mystics, Saints, and Radicals. In the second video, we left off talking about page 214 of the reading, and specifically Teresa's, her spiritual director's language of this being like a dark night of the soul, right? So we see the way in which this experience that John of the Cross was so articulate in describing, kind of playing itself out here with Teresa of Calcutta as well. And the kind of the key paradox here is a third down on page 214, where the author writes, it can be born only in the assurance of God's hidden presence and of the union with Jesus, who, in his passion, had to bear the burden of darkness of the sinful world for our salvation. The sure sign of God's hidden presence in this darkness is the thirst for God, the craving for at least a ray of light. So there are kind of two layered paradoxes here. First of all, there's this the idea that God's present always, almost essentially in a hidden form. This goes all the way back to the piece that we read at the beginning from Smith on mystery. And the question that one of the questions that have kind of been animating our conversation this semester about how does God appear? And if God is is non-material, if God is spiritual, I mean, none of the senses, none of the, we never see God, we never feel God, not directly, not in the usual way we use those words. How does God appear? God necessarily appears mysterious, hidden, veiled. And so on one hand, what does it mean to reveal something that's hidden, essentially hidden, not to reveal it as later to be kind of unhidden, no longer hidden, but to reveal it as hidden? The second kind of point here is that the sign of this mysterious hidden presence is the thirst for God, the desire for God. That the deep animating desire for God that's driving Mother Teresa along, and we might say that drives any of us along if kind of in a spiritual context, is itself the activity, the presence of God, that desire is God's presence. And this is consistent, at least, with this idea that has been kind of part of Christian history from the beginning, that God is love. So, if we look at the rest of page 214, first of all, I do want to kind of note that, this is not Teresa on her own. This is Teresa in conversation with her community, in the context of her community, in conversation with her director. So this is not something that she could come to kind of just sitting there thinking and reflecting, and it emphasizes the importance of kind of community for our spiritual development. But on page 214, she gives us this profound statement. After her director emphasizes the way in which God is present in the desire for God, even if that piece isn't fully present, she writes, "I can't express in words the gratitude I owe you for your kindness to me. For the first time in 11 years, I have come to love the darkness." That line, "I've come to love the darkness," to recognize that even that emptiness, the desire that animates that emptiness, is still part of God's presence. I think there's a lot that we can gain from thinking about this right now in such a weird and, for many of us, profoundly difficult time. And the various difficult times in our lives when we yearn for peace and tranquility and stability. The insight that's coming out of this reading is that yearning itself, that desire, that, to go all the way back to Augustine, that restlessness is the animation of God's love in ourselves. What else can we say about Teresa here? Again, on page 216, a few lines down there. Her darkness was an identification with those who she served. It's a very kind of Christological insistence here, that one of the main points made by the Christian tradition from the beginning is that God is in solidarity with us. God is identified with us in the person of Jesus. I mean, that's the claim, that if Jesus is God, and Jesus is fully human and fully God, then God knows what it's like to be hurt, to be suffering, to be lost, to be alone, to be frightened, to be in pain, to be despairing. It's what the Christian church celebrates this week with Good Friday. And so here, in an echo of what we saw with Francis's kind of imitation of Christ, we have an imitation of Christ in Mother Teresa's deep identification with those who she serves. That not only is it, again, a physical or material poverty, but it's a spiritual poverty as well. On page 218, we have a reiteration of John of the Cross and the dark night here. But where there's a slight difference, that the author talks about, Teresa did not label her own suffering as a dark night, although I think we can say that it is a dark night, but there's a distinction here from John's. She had the intuition, and now confirmation from her spiritual director, that although the sufferings were similar, their purpose was different. And so where John's suffering was kind of a purgation, a purgative suffering, right? An emptying of his kind of comforts and his material desires and even his intellectual desires. For Teresa, the purpose of her suffering was unity with Jesus in and through the poorest of the poor. The language here at the bottom of 218 to 219, that God wants to make sure to drain out of me every drop of myself. It actually struck me, a lot of what I've read over the years, written by artists, speak about kind of a devotion to their call as kind of a draining of the self, a loyalty to the artistic kind of inspiration, rather than the kind of the self's ego. And so we see something similar here in Teresa. On page 222, she writes a lot about the loneliness she feels. Again, loneliness, even though she is always surrounded by other people, and that this loneliness is a feeling of being kind of maybe at some level not fully understood or not fully comfortable with those people that she's with, meaning her own community. And for those of us who have ever felt like we don't quite have a place, or we don't quite belong, or even among our family or our friends, we're not quite where we're supposed to be. We're still restless, to use Augustine's word. Teresa's honesty here about her own loneliness, even in her spiritual life, is, I think, comforting and inspiring. On page 230, let's move to or actually, before we get to 230, where are we now? 226. Mother Teresa kept wondering at the paradox of her life. How could God be so close, yet feelings indicated the opposite? And that whole paragraph gives us just a little bit more texture, a little bit kind of, it thickens our discussion about this sense that of her closeness to God only through the poor. Again, which is probably a big part of what has driven her to live the life that she's lived. On page 230, this is one of the lines that's actually most often quoted from this book. About 10 lines down, she writes, "If I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven to light the light of those in darkness on earth. Teresa is not the only saint to have said something like this, but what we have here is this insistence that her spiritual vocation to be with the poorest of the poor, spiritually poorest of the poor, will continue even after her death, that she will remain outside of heaven as long as somebody else is, that she will remain away from God's presence to be in solidarity with those who feel far from God's presence. There's certainly a lot of symbolic language in there to remain outside of heaven, and there's a lot of metaphor, and to kind of tease that out as a whole another kind of discussion on heaven and hell and afterlife theology and stuff that we won't get into. But I think we can appreciate the tenacity of this sense of mission, that she is to feel spiritually apart from God as long as somebody else is. So the darkness for Teresa is not an end in itself, but the darkness is a way of opening to deeper compassion, to deeper mercy. We can ask all sorts of questions about Teresa, about the kind of ways in which her life became kind of she became the symbol for all holiness during her lifetime. Right? Mother Teresa for a long time has kind of been the opposite of Adolf Hitler in examples that we talk about, right? If we want to talk about the worst of the worst person we can think of, we just kind of throw Hitler out there. And if we want to talk about the greatest person, we say, well, I'm not Mother Teresa, right? I'm just a normal person. So her life, even when she was alive, was because of the attention she got during her life, was almost synonymous with holiness while she was alive. And I've already mentioned some of the kind of controversies around the tenacity of her poverty, some of the ways in which her own narrative was being kind of co-opted and controlled by the powerful men of church leadership, the bishops and popes. There are ways to criticize the fact that she wasn't too focused on what we would call structural critiques of asking why there are so many people poor and hungry and dying alone in Calcutta. Those weren't her concerns. She was not interested in kind of the abstraction of structural problems, but with the immediacy of the person in front of her. So again, just like with everyone we've looked at, the story of Teresa of Calcutta is not without possible places for critique. But once again, we have an example of somebody who took seriously this claim on the part of Jesus that we see in the Gospels, that Jesus appears to us in the hungry and thirsty and naked and homeless of our world. And in a time like this, when some of us live so comfortably and others are struggling to get by, Teresa's witness certainly should challenge all of our pretenses to security and to kind of meriting the comforts and privileges that we have. All right, so next week will be our last week with this stuff, and we'll start talking a little bit about a couple of contemporary Jesuit thinkers.